Hey, hi everybody. How you guys doing? I actually I hate following Mike, because he's so passionate. You know what I mean? And I always, he's just such a great, effective presenter. And this is actually not even the first time I've had to follow Mike, because he and I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee not so long ago about the domestic use of drones. And so once again, I find myself immediately after Mike talking about drones and other robotics. On the other hand, Chris Anderson was so afraid of following me that he canceled, so it's clear that I must have something really interesting to say. Technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, robot regulation. This is kind of a Larry Lessig type, type slide here. So basically what I want to talk about a little bit is why did we have, a whole hearing on the domestic use of drones by law enforcement by a full Senate Judiciary Committee? Why did Pink show up and protest? Why did Seattle's drone program get shut down by protesters, even though the drones can only stay up in the air for 15 minutes at a time and we're free, right? Why is this happening, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how law and politics ends up interacting with robotic technology of various kinds. And the first thing I'm going to focus on is going to be privacy. So this inscrutable graph I'm going to explain to you, right, is my attempt to try to explain why some technologies like drones end up getting regulated, and they are getting regulated, right? They're a baseline regulation by the FAA, which is getting more and more interested in privacy. There are states that have weighed in and imposed various kinds of restrictions, and we should expect more. Why is something like drones getting regulated and something like Street View by Google, or even the big data, which I have to think that big data actually has more aptitude for mischief at a privacy level maybe than drones. Why is that not really being regulated right now? And so one of my sort of vague attempts to make sense of this whole thing has been to say, well, what it is about drones in particular is that it's easy for us to form a mental model of two things, right? It's easy for us to visualize sort of two things. And one is we can really picture what a violation looks like. We can really picture what it looks like for something to violate our civil liberties like a drone, right? It's this big metal inscrutable military technology flying overhead. And then we can also envision what the harm might be. And so the V is the sort of the violation and the H is the harm. It's just easy for us to conceptualize. So compare that to something like big data. We can all sort of talk about what the harms of big data might be, but what does a big data harm look like? Do you know what I mean? Like, what does a violation by big data look like? It's really difficult to visualize. And you have folks like Dan Solov and others doing extremely admirable jobs of trying to give us a theoretical lens by which to look at something like big data, dating back years now. But for most of the public, it's been very difficult to sort of visualize what it might be like. Something like Big Brother, where literally there's a camera in your television looking at you, right? It's very easy to visualize the harm. It's very easy to visualize the violation. And so that line, that dotted line right there, is a representation, perhaps, of the barrier at which regulation will kick in. And I think you can talk about a lot of privacy and technology debates as efforts to move one of those two things over one side or the other, right? To ratchet down the harm, to ratchet up our ability to visualize what the harm might be, and so forth. And so, this doesn't capture a lot of the effects that are going on, the business and other kinds of interests, but I think it helps try to explain why we have this sort of visceral reaction to some kinds of technologies, and we have a whole conference around them, and others which, might, be just as compromising of civil liberties potentially, we don't necessarily. So that's the first puzzle, regulatory puzzle I want to talk about. The second one is also about human reactions to new technology. So you heard from Mike, and I'm sure you've heard from other people, that one of the great things about driverless cars is that there will be fewer accidents, right? There's going to be fewer accidents because so much, enormous percentage of accidents are really a function of human error. Overwhelmingly, that's a factor in accidents. And so the idea would be that if there's all this human error that happens, well, if we had robots driving cars, then we'd just be able to shrink the amount of error. And we just have this better situation, and everybody should be happy because of the fact that not only can you text in Nevada and elsewhere, but in addition, you actually have people's lives are saved by this, right? The trouble with this picture is that this is not how it's going to look. This visualization is not accurate. It's going to look more like this. Why does that matter? That matters because even though there's going to be fewer robot errors in the context of, say, driverless cars, right, or planes, or whatever it happens to be, some set of those errors are going to be outside of what human error would have done. In other words, had there been a human in the loop or responsible, then, then there wouldn't have been that error. One example might be that a driverless car is always going to be better than a human at avoiding a shopping cart, and it's always going to be better at a human than avoiding a stroller. But what happens if it confronts a stroller and a shopping cart at the same time, right? I mean, you or I are going to plow right into that shopping cart without thinking about it, but will the robot do that? And if the robot ever makes a mistake, the headline reads, "Driverless car kills baby to save groceries," and Mike is out of a job, okay? And so how do we capture, again, the benefit of a technology like driverless cars, which has environmental benefits, has all kinds of ennobling qualities, like allowing people mobility that wouldn't have it otherwise? How do we sort of deal with that probability? Because the truth of the matter is that we have this sort of complicated relationship with these machines that are entering into our lives and taking over certain roles. So that brings me to the sort of last graph that I'm going to dwell on here, actually, right? And it's, I don't know if it's not so much of a graph as my horrible attempt at, actually, I think I just loaded up the lame slide that they give you in PowerPoint, right? And then just kind of like made it into a frowny thing with that little, yeah, so this is not very qual. But think about this for a moment. So what isn't interesting that just by drawing a circle and a couple of dots and changing the line on the face just a little tiny bit, it just changes our feelings about our orientation towards these pixels on a screen in interesting ways. So I work at the University of Washington, and my colleagues work on a lot of really interesting things around human-robot interaction. For instance, my colleague Peter Kahn in the psychology department has done a bunch of experiments where he tries to get children to talk about whether a robot that they're encountering that's anthropomorphic is alive or not alive. Is it like a person? Is it social, or is it not? And these kids are not really able to do that effectively. And they say things like, it's alive in a way, but not in another way. And they're just not willing to commit to the idea that it is inanimate or that it is animate, basically. And this ends up being true all the way up to adolescence, and now he's doing, expanding on that work with other representations. And as Peter observes, we don't get confused about whether a brick is an animate object or an inanimate object. We don't get confused about whether a hammer is, okay? So as a consequence, Peter and his students wanted to test whether this would have sort of real-world effects. And so one of the things that they did was they would, I don't know, it's sort of out of Footloose, but they would basically have you put a robot into like a closet or in a corner, right? And it would like sort of say that it wanted to get out, and you weren't allowed to. And they would sort of measure whether people were willing to put baby in or a robot in the corner, basically. And they've just done all these studies, and what they find is that there's this real reticence. Other studies, I think, somewhat less effective than Peter's, have measured all kinds of different things about whether people are willing to harm someone, basically shut a robot down if it's protesting. Please don't shut me down. You're going to erase my memory, right? Another different colleague at the University of Washington in the School of Ed has recently completed a study suggesting that soldiers' attachments to the robots that are in the military field, emotional attachments to these things are such that it actually can and does affect battle outcomes. And in fact, even dating back to Peter Singer's book that launched a lot of us into robotics, Wired for War, you hear anecdotal evidence of soldiers like risking their lives in order to save a packbot by iRobot. And if you go to iRobot, you see that there's these letters from soldiers talking about how this robot was a part of the team. So how does that sort of relate to domestic law? I think it's going to end up relating to domestic law in extremely interesting ways, right? And so the work of Kate Darling is particularly illuminating here, where she talks about, there's this idea that we're going to be worried about robot rights and that we're going to need to confer rights to robots. And I think that that's really far-fetched if you take it as the idea that robots would actually be conscious, right? I mean, I talk to a lot of people in artificial intelligence, and they say things to me like, we've been doing artificial intelligence since that term was coined, actually at my alma mater in the 1950s, and today robots are about as smart as insects. So the prospect that we're going to have like conscious robots anytime soon, I think, is extraordinarily far-fetched. But because of our tendency to react to social machines as though they were social, because of our conflation, basically, of what appears to be social, what is actually, means that we may feel uncomfortable with the treatment of robots, the ill treatment of robots, well short of them actually making claims about consciousness. And so Kate talks about drawing a link to animal cruelty. Do we want to be the kind of society that permits torture me Elmo videos that you see on YouTube, right? Another sort of interesting facet is Dr. Victoria Groom out of Stanford had conducted a study where she found that people feel differently about tasks they perform with robots when the robot is anthropomorphic and when they're familiar with the robot from visiting with it before than if it's not anthropomorphic and it's more like a tool, and that people feel like a sense of shared blame with a robot when something goes wrong if it's anthropomorphic, and they also feel like sort of like it's also the robot's fault, and also they share praise with the robot, right? So think about how that might relate to medical malpractice for surgical robots, right? I mean, today so much of medical malpractice is basically driven by bedside manner, and that's why hospitals have procedures in place so that you meet with the surgeon beforehand, and she talks to you about the surgery and everything, and then afterwards, they have these protocols in place for you to interact at a human level with your doctors and surgeons, precisely because they know that medical malpractice is driven by these kinds of things. So now that people are getting sued over the Da Vinci, the Intuitive Surgical's robotic platform, our hospital is going to have to start to think about their protocol as to meeting the robot. And they really are doing this, right? And so somebody I know had robotic surgery actually twice, and she said that what that hospital had settled on was the option of watching a video about robotics. And it wouldn't be so far-fetched to think that at some point Intuitive Surgical might want to build in something into its contract specifying precisely how the robot would be used. But we would never be having this conversation about whether you should meet the scalpel or the operating table, right? Here's the scalpel. It's very sharp. You know what I mean? So you wouldn't do that, right? And it doesn't make any sense. So I think that there's going to be this really interesting issue about category error and category conflation. In fact, Peter Kahn from the University of Washington, thinks that robots actually form a kind of new ontological category. And all the stuff out of Cliff Nass's lab and B.J. Fogg and so forth at Stanford, the so-called computers as social actors theory, again and again and again, tells us that we are just hardwired to react to this social technology as though it were really human. And so it would be surprising if psychology and social science and so forth were struggling with this concept and trying to make a place for social machines, in their language and in their discussion. It would be surprising if it didn't bear also on ours. So basically, I think that although we're not going to see a total sea change with the introduction of robotics into mainstream society, I think we're going to see systematic changes. And I think we're going to have to face challenges like the idea that people will overreact to a decision made by a robot, like the fact that people will protest drones when they wouldn't think twice about protesting a GPS device, and they wouldn't think twice about protesting a license plate reader. but they just feel this visceral reaction. You know, just one sort of more example on this front, it's like if you think about if something went wrong with the police, you know, and a police officer shot somebody or a police officer hit them with their car, right? You would see you know, you would see guns the next day. You would see police cars the next day. But if we had police robots assisting in everyday law enforcement and something went wrong, I bet we wouldn't. I bet we wouldn't see another robot, that robot or another one like it, back on the street again because of, again, our reactions to it. And so I'm all for celebrating the rosy future of robotics. I think it's a transformative technology. I think we really should be rolling up our sleeves to make sure we get this right. But I do think that there are a lot of challenges, and I think a lot of them are linked to the way that we feel about this technology. So okay, with that, you know, thanks very much. Appreciate it.